Hello and welcome back to Chapter 13, which will be our final chapter in the middle childhood era. We're going to be discussing psychosocial development from 6 to puberty. All right, let's get started. All right, let's start off by talking about something that is true for most children in the United States, that they will have siblings. There are a growing number of only children in the world, and so there's been a lot of research on the only child. About 30% of families in the United States have only one child, which means that the majority of families have two or more. It's more common in urban settings to have an only child than it is in suburban or rural settings. Now, when we make comparisons of only children to firstborns, because you can imagine that an only child is kind of like a firstborn, right? Because they spend time with their parents before there's any other children when you're a firstborn. The parents are novices, whether you're a firstborn or an only child. There's a lot of things that are very similar between how an only child and a firstborn might be reared. So we're going to use firstborns as our comparison group, and what I'm going to report is based on research on only children compared to firstborns. They have found superior outcomes in the areas of educational achievement for only children and intelligence scores and conscientiousness. On average, only children tend to go farther in school. That is, they're more likely to graduate high school, go on to college. At every metric, the only children are more likely to have achieved that level of education. They tend to have slightly higher intelligence scores. It's not enormous, but it's about 3 to 5 points on the intelligence test. With average being 100, you're talking about a 3 or 4% increase. And then they're higher in conscientiousness. This is a personality trait that is measured using a test called the Big Five inventory. And what this portion of the inventory tests is how concerned the person is with being on time, following rules, basically behaving in a way that's showing that they're concerned for behaving correctly. Only children tend to score higher on that than people who are firstborns or later even. There are equivalent outcomes between only children and firstborns on psychological adjustment, which is one of the things that is a stereotype about only children, that they will have poorer psychological adjustment than children who have siblings, and that is not supported by the data. The data supports these other superior outcomes. They find that you can't tell an only child from a firstborn with regard to their psychological adjustment. Now, what that includes is things like mental health issues like depression and anxiety. And then also it has to do with being slow to warm up, for example, which is something that our textbook talked about earlier in infancy. It has to do with being adventuresome or fearful. It has just sort of how comfortable the person is in their environment, basically, is psychological adjustment. And we have equivalent outcomes. Then the other one is sociability, which is a really common stereotype about only children, that they'll be more shy and not want to be around other people that much because they were alone with their parents all the time, which, by the way, I'd like to point out their parents are people, but I think I know what they mean, peers. So it turns out that there is no difference in how sociable, how much the person wants to be around other people as a function of whether they were an only child or a firstborn child. So we probably don't need to worry a lot about only children or people who are considering only having one child, because where there are differences, they tend to be, the advantage tends to go to the only child. Nevertheless, about 70% of families have multiple children, and so let's talk a little bit about having siblings, brothers and sisters. Another big stereotype is that children will compete and that they're always trying to get their parents' attention. And in fact, the psychoanalysts coined the term sibling rivalry, where they will maybe even harm their sibling in order to get their parents' attention. It turns out that that's not the main pattern of interaction for siblings. When you were growing up, if you had siblings, you probably know that you spent a lot of time either being completely neutral with your sibling, where you weren't even really interacting with them, maybe watching the same show, or one of you was coloring and the other was playing with Play-Doh, or something like that, very neutral. or positive, where you played together, or you got into some kind of little caper together, or things like that, had a secret that you shared, or that most of the time the interactions were neutral to positive. But what catches our attention are the negative interactions. And so when we look back and we're supposed to describe our relationship with our siblings, sometimes we'll come up with times when we got into fights, or we had some big problem that happened with our siblings, but it's not the main pattern. It's probably so distinctive because it's unusual, because it was unusual for the interactions with the siblings. Now, most interactions within sibling pairs or triads, or however many kids are there, are initiated by the older sibling. Whether it's a pro-social behavior or it's a antisocial behavior, usually it's the older sibling who initiates. So it's the older sibling who shares something. It's the older sibling who takes something away. It tends to be the older sibling will come up with the idea for what game we're going to play, or what socio-dramatic play we're going to engage in, stuff like that. Younger siblings spend a lot of time imitating their older siblings. It's funny, the last time we got a new edition of our textbook was right prior to my first grandchild being born. Now I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old grandchildren, and it is amazing how much that 1-year-old follows around that 3-year-old, doing everything that she does. It's he's 2 years behind her in age, but he's trying so hard to keep up with her and what she does, right? It's like really amazing how much he just follows her around and imitates everything that she does. Right now at 3, it's not bothering her. I know when I was the little kid who was following my brother around, it used to drive him nuts. But I, of course, remember that, so I was probably more than 5 years old when he was making those complaints that I was following him around all the time. But it's remarkable to watch the little child, the little sibling, looking up so much to their older sibling and wanting to do what they're doing. On average, same-sex siblings tend to be more close, is because they oftentimes share similar interests, or they are in the same activities, things like that. And so a lot of times if you have multiple children, they'll pair off into their same-sex groups. If you have only 2 children in the family and they're both boys or they're both girls, or they're a mixed-sex pair, probably there's not a lot of difference in the closeness. But oftentimes, as far as how much time they spend with each other, how many pro-social acts they do for each other, how many antisocial acts they do against each other, if you keep track of all that stuff, it's not that different between mixed-sex pairs and same-sex pairs. But oftentimes the siblings will report that they have warmer feelings towards their same-sex sibling than mixed-sex pairs will say about each other. How about the role of mom working during middle childhood? Very common pattern these days for moms to work. In the dark ages of my childhood, it was just starting to be the norm for moms to work when they had middle childhood age kids. My mom worked at that time. They talked a lot about latchkey kids who wore their house key around their neck on a necklace, and they would come home to an empty house where they would be alone for an hour and a half. And when you're talking about middle childhood kids, especially if we're in the upper part of that, the 8 to 12-year-olds, it's feasible that they might come home to an empty house, or an empty house with them and their older sibling maybe, or maybe they might, even if they're younger, come home to a babysitter, or go to after-school care at a neighbor's house. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that people deal with that hour and a half that tends to exist between the end of school and the parents returning. But let's talk a little bit about the research findings regarding maternal employment on the development of the children. So obviously we would understand why mom would work and how it might benefit her and how it might benefit the finances of the family or other things. But what does it do for the children? So one benefit is that they oftentimes are going to have more responsibilities at home. And this is actually really good for child development, to feel like they're contributing to the household, that they're important and grown up in certain ways, and that they can really help. Builds pride, right? We're going to talk at the end of this lecture a little bit about Erickson's model, but remember when we just talked in the last age bracket about how when children show initiative and it's rewarded, they feel pride. right? And so when kids come home after school and maybe they have some chores to complete, something like that, it makes them feel proud that they can help like that. And so that's good. And it also helps them to build conscientiousness. It helps them to build self-motivation. A whole bunch of good things can come from children having more responsibility. Now, if we talk just about daughters who have working moms, we see that on average, they will have higher achievement goals and will have higher self-esteem compared to daughters whose moms do not work. On average. Now, I'm not talking about any individual person. Moms don't have to work in order for their daughters to have high achievement, and they don't have to work in order for their daughters to have high self-esteem. It's just that on average, when you compare daughters whose moms work to daughters whose moms don't work, we see these higher effects among those who's worked. There's also a higher belief in women's competence. So little girls who see their moms working, see their moms making decisions or keeping a schedule or, paying their own bills and a bunch of different things that make the daughter internalize, well, someday when I'm older, I'll be doing these things too. Right? That this is part of my sex role, is to be a person who takes care of these kinds of things and makes decisions, and they internalize that women have great competence. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Now, sons, we find that sons whose moms work tend to display better psychological adjustment than sons whose moms are at home. Now, again, it's not 100% at all, but it's on average better adjustment among those whose moms work. And part of that might be because they have more responsibilities at home and less being taken care of and sort of, made to feel like they're not competent because their moms are taking care of too much. A lot of times moms who work at home in the form of being a mom look at it like it's their job, and they're supposed to be making all the meals and cleaning the house and doing all the laundry, and they treat it like a job, and they are not helping their children to grow and develop into, one day this will be their job too, unfortunately, is taking care of a house and making their own food and doing their own laundry and those kinds of things. And so it's better for kids to have responsibilities, especially boys. Boys also internalize that women are competent by watching their moms work. And so that's a great benefit, that it causes them to grow up and expect that, that their future girlfriends or wives or partners will be able to hold down jobs and do these kinds of things as well, if that's what she wants, right? If that's what their partner wants. And then they also learn more about men's warmth, because a lot of times in two-parent households, sons are being more parented by their father than they would be if their mom was home full time. And so dad is doing more of these sort of nurturing behaviors that maybe he would have left to his stay-at-home wife, but because they both are working, he's doing some of the nurturing, just like she's doing some of the things that typically would have been left to a working dad to do. I haven't even addressed the issue of it's becoming more and more common in the U.S. for moms to be not only the primary breadwinner, but in a lot of families, the only breadwinner. And that's an interesting message for children to be getting also, that either sex can stay home with the kids, that either sex can support the family, things like that. I think I told you earlier about the fact that I worked full time and my husband stayed home with our kids. And the impact on their gender role identity was basically that what I was doing is what women do and what dad was doing is what men do. So it's not a smooth pathway to, an androgynous sex role attitude, that's for sure. Kids definitely infer what they infer. Now, there are some downsides to moms working. I put this same thing at the very bottom, more responsibilities at home. A lot of times taking care of things around the house will detract from the children's ability to, participate in an after-school sport or to complete their homework on time or other kinds of things. So if there's too many responsibilities, it could actually interfere with what the children's jobs are, which is to grow and develop, right? They have less time with each of their parents, which can be a downside, right? A lot of times it's about sometimes it's about quantity time, not quality time, just being there with the kids and sort of being able to relax and let things flow the way that they naturally do is harder to do when everybody's working. And then we do see that kids who are coming home to an empty household, as they start to, get a little bit closer to puberty, we start to see earlier onset of sexual activity. We start to see them engaging in substance abuse. A lot of times parents Believe that if they check in with their kids and, tell them not to do these things, that the kids will, not be bringing people into the house or engaging in activities that the parents don't want them to do. But if you're very predictable and come home at a very predictable time, it doesn't take a genius kid to figure out how to squeeze some misbehaviors in while the parents are gone. So that is definitely a risk if you have children who are at home and unsupervised. And the closer the kids get to 12 and 13 years old, the parents start to think, well, they can supervise themselves, right? And they can supervise their younger siblings. And they're hoping that it's going to be a developmental growth time, but they actually are introducing an opportunity for something harmful to happen. So that's definitely a downside. All right, let's go ahead and stop here. We'll come back in the next segment. We'll talk about peers. They are getting more and more important as we age here.